Hello, and welcome to the Compact Podcast. Another week, another round of elections, this time for the European Parliament. And another verdict, this time for Hunter Biden, who, after a week-long trial, was found guilty of 3 charges relating to buying a handgun in 2018 while being a user of crack cocaine. He's the first child of a president to be found guilty of a crime. His father, Joe Biden, has vowed not to pardon him. We'll also discuss this very magazine's inclusion as a listed entity on a recent Ukrainian NGO report on supposed Russian disinformation. Compact, Sohrab and Matthew are featured there alongside dozens of sitting politicians such as JD Vance and Josh Hawley, but no Democratic lawmakers. We'll ask who funds such lists and what is their purpose. Do check out Sohrab's very recent Substack on this precise issue. I'm your host, Nina Power, and I'm joined today by Sohrab Ahmari, Matthew Schmitz, and Geoff Shullenberger. So, some shock this week following the European elections. Newspapers insisted on talking about a, quote, far-right swing, but often this language masks reasonable positions held by the electorate on economics, foreign policy, particularly Ukraine, and the environment, namely resistance to net zero policies. Following the victory of Marine Le Pen's national rally in France, who received double his vote, President Emmanuel Macron has called snap elections in France for the end of June and early July, around the same time as the UK's own general election. Quite a gamble from Macron. Elsewhere in Germany, the AfD came second to the conservative CDU party, and Sarah Wagenknecht, BSW's party, who we've discussed on this show and elsewhere in Compact, running for the first time, received a respectable 6%. Italy's Meloni shored up her vote with 29%. We ran a very interesting take on these European elections from Daryl E. Paul, who noted the collapse in support for Green parties, in particular, across the continent. This so-called green lash follows massive farmers' protests, which we've covered a lot in Compact, and resistance to net zero policies, as I've mentioned. Paul argues that the fall of the Greens is the inverse of the populist right, who have added anti-green policies to their anti-immigration policies. How do we feel about the European election results?
I don't have any particular insights, so I will just point our readers to the column that appeared yesterday in compactmag.com by our columnist, Daryl Paul, under the headline, Europe Turns Against the Greens. He takes note of the fact that across core Europe, where European Green parties have been very powerful, they've amassed a great deal of power. In Germany, they're part of the coalition with the Social Democrats, Belgium, France, elsewhere. In all of these places, voters thrashed the Green parties because they associate them with a new kind of austerity, not neoliberal austerity, but green austerity. It's the kind of thing where, if you go to your hotel room in parts of Europe, you can't turn up or down the temperature, beyond certain thresholds. It's made energy very expensive in Germany, especially, not only by obviously the sanctions imposed on Russian energy, but then also banning all sorts of other forms of energy, not least nuclear, so that Germany actually, as a result of the Greens, is actually burning a ton of expensive coal. I think that's one important development that hasn't been as much analyzed as the rise of the so-called far right or populist and national conservative parties in some countries, and it's worth that would be my contribution. Is go read Daryl Paul, Europe against the Greens at compactmag.com. I'll just make one other quick note, which is it's in my Substack. If you're a reader of the compactmag.substack.com blog, where we do kind of a lot of more raw, immediate takes from myself, generally on Wednesdays, though I often post an additional piece. And Nina writes a Friday roundup newsletter. If you go there, I have a kind of briefly noted item at the bottom of my main piece, just noting that if you read like The Guardian or the New York Times, the mainstream press, often there's just this kind of reference to the rise of the far right or the rise of populism, and they treat a kind of wide range of parties across this vast kind of political geography and this variegated social landscape across a whole continent as though they're like this monolithic formation. In fact, they aren't. First of all, there's like three groups jostling within the European Parliament for supremacy within the right. There's the identity group. There is the European People's Party, which is more of the center right formation led by Germany's Ursula von der Leyen. And then there is this unattached group in which you find it's led by Hungary's Fidesz after Fidesz was expelled or actually had to remove itself because of the pressures that it was being put under politically in a matter of ideology by the EPP. And these are, first of all, they disagree among themselves. But I think if you had to like divide up the three types of populist parties or national conservative parties, I would offer the following grouping. The one I think is exemplified by Fidesz. They're not the only ones, but they're the best exemplar, are really serious, responsible, have a broad popular governing majority. So like in these elections, okay, they lost 2 seats, but generally they still did quite well. And their pitch was very simple: no war, no migration, no gender ideology. And it's not just that they say these things, but they've actually managed to enact them into an attractive social agenda. So that's the Fidesz model. And then you have, frankly, what I think are the kind of fake populists exemplified by Giorgia Meloni, who, runs on a lot of culture war rhetoric, but when things come down to it, when it really matters, she's very much frankly, toes the line of the EU and NATO mandarins. And finally, you have the cranks. There's a new party in Romania, which basically is built on various Romanian ethnic hatreds. They hate Ukrainians, not in the way of like they don't want to help Ukraine or they want to de-escalate the war. They like hate Ukrainians as a nationality. They hate Hungarians, and of course, they hate the Jews. And they're just kind of provocateurs. And so I think there's a question there is like, which way, populist man? Are you going to go the way of Fidesz and be responsible and maintain a durable majority and lean into small d democracy and build a social movement, etc.? Or are you going to be a kind of, provocateur or just sort of outrage party that is easy to co-opt or eventually and can't build a national majority? So the far right or the hard right or whatever, the populist, is not this monolithic block. And I will stop there.
One interesting thing to think about in terms of the decline of European Green parties is the stance that these parties have taken toward the conflict in Ukraine. Wasn't that long ago, certainly within lifetimes of everyone on this podcast, that Green parties were identified with anti-war movements, skeptical of intervention abroad. Voting for a Green Party candidate could be a way to signal your disagreement with the foreign policy of hawks like George W. Bush. Now, Green parties are some of the most hawkish forces when it comes to the fight against Russia and Ukraine. Certainly, everyone has a right to change his mind, but it's an interesting reversal. It also, kind of stepping away from the kind of immediate geopolitical issues, touches on the energy problems that I think are really at the center of dissatisfaction with green policies. Uh, Russia, of course, is a supplier of cheap energy to Europe, especially to German industry. If Greens are, uh, aiming for kind of carbon neutrality or net zero, uh, you know, frankly, they have no reason to oppose this conflict on narrow economic grounds. They're maybe looking at the pain or the bite that European consumers and European businesses are feeling and thinking, well, that's not such a bad thing. Give war a chance.
Just one remark, pointing to a piece by Compact columnist Thomas Fazio, though published in Unheard, on these elections, titled "Europe's Insurgent Right Won't Change Anything." And what he points to is really just the structure of the European Parliament. And, basically he argues that the European Parliament isn't really a parliament in the normal sense, and that it's not able to initiate, its members are not able to initiate legislation. And therefore, it's kind of a defanged parliament. Um, it doesn't really have significant power. It's as he presents, a kind of more of a facade of democracy, because ultimately, power within the EU lies in the European Council, which is appointed by Europe's leaders. So there's no direct election of the actual leadership of the European Union. And so the Parliament is more of a kind of rubber stamp operation that kind of puts the veneer of democracy on what's fundamentally an undemocratic, and was designed as explicitly as an anti-democratic entity. The purpose of which was to kind of suppress the unruly demands of the demos, and thereby protect the interests of of business elites, essentially. And so, there is something. It's just worth thinking about, like, what the European Parliament actually is, and because the European Union is not in fact a democratic, and is an anti-democratic entity by design. There's something quite theatrical about this whole affair. I mean, I remember finding it strange a decade ago or so, when you had, like, someone like Nigel Farage first emerge as a major figure, and these sort of Brexit. I mean, prior to Brexit actually happening, it was kind of strange that you had, like, a huge number of people who were part of UKIP, of Farage's UKIP, which was a party dedicated to leaving the European, whose single agenda was to leave the European Union, elected to the Parliament of the European Union. So I think that, and the further point is that these are, essentially low turnout elections, so they're not, that they're often similar to in the U.S. sort of midterm elections, in that they tend to bring about a kind of backlash against whatever the sort of incumbent parties in charge at the national level are. And so they're kind of an opportunity to vent a certain discontent, but in a way that's quite contained and doesn't really have much potential to bring about any change. And so, a further point that's kind of interesting is that there is this sort of, somewhat pan-European, although, as Sohrab said, there are significant divisions within it, but sort of national populist trend. And so, one sort of interesting question coming out of this, which was raised by Hamilton Craig in a column for us about the legacy of Clemens von Metternich, the architect of the European order of the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, where he sort of asked, what the conservative vision of a sort of Europe, a European-wide sort of conservative order would look like. Because clear, what's interesting is that in the 19th century, it was really the liberals who tended to be nationalists, and the concern with maintaining order on the level of the continent was the concern of aristocratic sort of ancien regime conservatives like Metternich. And so then the question I think Craig posed there was, what a sort of, much of the energy on the right is towards sort of national conservatism, national populism, and so on. But, what an alternative vision of a continental order would look like. And so I suppose that's sort of the challenge for, and I think for the reasons I stated, the the European Parliament doesn't really have the power to fundamentally transform the European Union. It's largely toothless, but it does kind of raise the question of what an alternative sort of continental order would look like if these kind of insurgent forces of the right were to get their way on some broader level that would allow them to exert greater influence than they'll have merely as sort of an insurgent caucus within the European Parliament.
Yeah, I think if we're getting to a situation where basically all votes are protest votes, which we can certainly see in the case of Brexit a few years ago, Britain leaving the EU, but I think also in these elections, yeah, sure, low turnout, but this kind of shift towards populist parties who are fundamentally taking lines against the liberal order on Ukraine and the environment and so on. Then and also in the UK, obviously, we've just had Nigel Farage enter the race with reform, and it looks like everybody's going to vote not for something, but against something, like whether it's against the Tories or for reform as a protest vote against the whole of Westminster. I mean, whether we genuinely see Farage and any of these characters as truly outsiders or not is another question. It's definitely debatable. Um, but I think, yeah, it's an interesting question about the future of Europe, especially if Germany's economy continues to decline, because without a powerful Germany, the EU is a very different kind of beast. But we'll see what happens in the French election with Macron. Obviously, he's been very unpopular in certain regards for a long time, but he has clung on, and this is quite a sort of power move to call a snap election so fast, even faster than the UK election. So yeah, I think this is an interesting couple of months for Europe and ex-Europe and maybe post-Europe. But yeah, back to the US. So Sohrab, you were working at the New York Post when the Hunter Biden laptop story was censored ahead of the 2020 presidential election and dismissed by Democrats as part of a supposed Russian disinformation campaign. I know you didn't work directly on the story, but you were at the newspaper at the time. We know, of course, that the laptop was authentic. There was no Russian campaign, and the laptop and its contents, some of them did feature in this current trial. Several commentators have suggested, however, that the trial on these gun charges and this related idea of drug use and addiction and so on, which has been played up by a kind of largely sympathetic left reception of the verdict. But others have been suggesting that this trial is actually a distraction from much more serious Biden family dealings, which include not only Hunter Biden but also his father, particularly with Ukraine and China, and that the trial itself took place to present this sort of facade of fair-handedness, particularly in the wake of Trump's guilty verdict last week. So we probably have mixed views on Hunter Biden and this trial, but it'd be interesting to hear what you all think.
So I'm actually one of the commentators who made that point, Nina, that, okay, if Hunter Biden had a drug problem and he lied about it on a federal background check form to obtain a handgun, of course he should pay the penalty for that and be held accountable. But the way in which some of the left media, the eagerness with which they're covering this and portraying this kind of great sacrifice on the part of his father, Joe Biden vowing not to not to pardon him, and then someone on MSNBC said, and that just shows how this family physically embodies the rule of law, is outrageous, because the gun problem is a kind of it's a offense against the public, but it doesn't have wider kind of public political ramification. The real issue is the influence peddling that Biden clearly engaged in, which was revealed by the Hunter Biden laptops and reported on first by the New York Post, which got banned by Twitter for the trouble. That's the real issue, and that implicates President Biden himself, because remember, the first story and the most devastating one was one in which an executive from Burisma, this shady Ukrainian energy company that was paying Hunter $83,000 a month to serve on its board, thanked him for arranging a meeting between Hunter's father, who was then the Obama administration's point man on Ukraine and the vice president of the United States, and those executives. And that's the influence peddling. Of course, there's also the Chinese deal, as you guys will remember. The Chinese Communist Party linked firm. The New York Post obtained the emails related to that, including the partners' kind of provisional divvying up of the future profits, in which there was a reference to 10% for the big guy. And Tony Bobulinski, sorry, I'm getting into like the weeds of the Hunter saga, but I know the details so well. Tony Bobulinski, who was a partner to Hunter at the time, and he's a naval intelligence officer and a lifelong Democrat, subsequently revealed that the 10% for the big guy is a reference to Joe Biden himself. So that's the real issue. And the censorship is the issue. And the fact that the censorship was legitimated by both traditional media, done by the social media, and by the deep state in the form of those 50 former intelligence officials who signed a letter based on exactly zero evidence, claiming that the Post's story was based on Russian disinformation, as you said. And those are really, in a way, it's like those people who need to be held accountable. It's big tech censorship. It's the shameful behavior of the mainstream media, which, instead of defending America's oldest continuously published daily, legitimated and cheered the censorship. And I was talking to a reporter for the New York Times yesterday about this, named Katie Roberts, who's their media reporter, and she said, "Well, what do you think? You've kind of been vindicated." And I said, "Well, yes, but it's a bittersweet moment, because I pointed out that at the time, none of the outlets who cheered the censorship did the one thing you're supposed to do. If you want to question a story, you need to if you want to question a story, you need to do your own reporting." That's not what they did. It's not like they went and actually dug into what Hunter Biden had been up to, or whether the laptop was authentic. They reported, without challenge, the assertion by these 50 intelligence officials that this is Russian disinformation. And I pointed out, I was like, "Katie, you yourself did a story," which she did, in which this was like soon after the story appeared, in which she quoted anonymous sources in the newsroom of the New York Post, revealing that, they were nervous about the story. They always, obviously, whatever, some junior editor or mid-level editor had leaked to the Times that we were uncomfortable and we didn't want to publish it. And I said, "That was your story, Katie. That's what you did at the Times, instead of actual reporting on this." So sorry, I get ranty about this because there's so many individual enraging details, but anyway, I think another strand in this, I was thinking like, like Hunter Biden, he just embodies American decline. Remember, like, when presidential sons, in the 19th century were all dignified and great, and then I remember this, like, that's actually not true. Like, we've had presidential fail sons going back to, John Adams had a son named Charles Adams, who was an alcoholic. Martin Van Buren's son was a drunk as well, and had a mistress her name was Amerigo Vespucci, which means she was a descendant of Amerigo Vespucci, after whom the continent is named. And he lost $5,000 in a poker game, and his opponent, who was fancying Amerigo Vespucci, said, "Okay, well, I'll forgive your poker debt to me if you let me have her," and he did. So presidential fail sonnery is an old story. If there's any real degeneration, it's in the relationship of the press to power, and the way that one side of power is always one half of the powerful in this country is always protected. Sorry, rant over.
No, very good. Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, it's I don't know. I think there's this growing kind of horror at the Biden family as a whole. I mean, Joe Biden's clearly unfit for office. He's that people are talking about elder abuse at this point. We mentioned this before, but it's very increasingly obvious he's not there. I'm always surprised when somebody clearly has trouble and they're in a position of with some status, like the son of a president, that they don't get more help. I mean, I would be, it wouldn't be amiss. It wouldn't have been amiss if they'd put Biden in some kind of care situation and some kind of rehab. Um, and this kind of floating laptop. I mean, it's not just the details of meetings with China and Ukraine, although these are obviously incredibly important, but all of these other minor crimes. I think he's also going to be on trial for some kind of tax non-payment later in the year. There's lots of seediness in the laptop, which people can find if they go down some rabbit holes online. So there's something kind of perhaps corrupt and disturbing about the power the Bidens as a whole have. Even when there's sadness there too. It's not a good look, America.
What Sohrab said about the essential kind of nature of this scandal is really important to remember, and that's the connection of the Biden family to Ukraine through Hunter, through Biden's own admitted interference in Ukraine's conduct of its internal affairs in terms of investigating corruption. That's the main thing. We are currently engaged at a certain remove, but engaged pretty directly in a war in Ukraine with Russia. We have advisors there. We continue to authorize more extensive use of armaments, strikes on Russian targets inside Russia. It was announced this week that the Azov Battalion, a group that I don't think is being designated far right, even though it may have more right to that label than some of the other groups that receive it. The Azov Battalion is now authorized to use certain weapon systems that it didn't previously have access to. All of this is unfolding. Certain interests are being served by the war in Ukraine, and we do need to clarify the Biden family's financial stake therein. Looking at the Hunter scandal on different terms, I'm reminded of a debate in the 2020 presidential election where Trump sought to highlight the scandal, brought up Hunter Biden's role, and Joe Biden responded indignantly with something like the following: "How dare you attack my son who served his country in Iraq and who died of cancer?" It was an interesting moment because Trump, of course, was talking about Hunter Biden, and then Joe responded indignantly, speaking of Beau Biden, his son, who was a veteran and who died of cancer. And I don't assume that mistake was because of a lapse of memory on Biden's part. It may have just been a very useful dodge, a way of changing the subject from the so-called fail son to the hero son. But in that moment, I think Biden showed a certain strength he has, and that's to be the suffering father, the father who has really taken great losses and seen huge disappointments and setbacks in terms of his children, whether it's Hunter struggling with addiction and being in and out of trouble with the law, or it's Beau Biden fighting overseas, being really the hope of the family, and then dying of cancer. Biden has seen a lot as a father that probably very few parents would want to see. So I think that we will see him continue to lean on that in this campaign. If there's a exchange at a debate about Hunter, he's probably going to really project his kind of So yeah, his nature as a kind of pitiable father, one who's suffered a great deal and deserves our sympathy. Uh, Trump, I think leans a little less directly on his role as a father than Biden has done, though it's also important for Trump. In this way, Trump doesn't have a very distinguished record when it comes to being a husband. I mean, unless being a husband many times over is a way of distinguishing yourself. Um, as a father, it looks a bit better. He has some children who are a little more alienated, but uh, most of his children are very publicly supportive of him and involved in his campaign. Uh, I was struck, I remember in 2016 when Trump was first running, speaking to some social conservatives about Trump. And one thing that they tended to say was, uh, his sons are respectful, or he seems to be a good father. That was taken as really a sign that there's something good in Trump because, you know, basically no living thing can shoot off from a dead branch. So if his sons seem to be respectful and responsible, that must say something good about Trump. So there may be kind of two contrasting images of fatherhood in these two men. Uh, you know, Biden may seem to be very powerful and wealthy and well connected, but his the losses he suffered as a father may make him more relatable. Certainly, there are a lot of Americans who have children who have struggled with addiction or who've lost children, whether it's to cancer or other horrible events. And likewise, Trump can maybe make a certain appeal as a good father, even if he's a bit of a rascal in other terms. So there may be two contrasting images of fatherhood that'll be on offer once again this fall.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think this is another moment in the history of the kind of apparent diffusing of scandal as a factor of the sort that it used to be in American political life. That I don't know, it just seems like everything that might have been a scandal that would, in some sense, drag down a politician at some prior moment is no longer that. It seems almost as if so I'm guessing the overall effect of this will sort of largely be a wash. And it seems to me, one way of perhaps interpreting Me Too was it was a kind of final resurgence of the politics of scandal, where like you know for example, Senator Al Franken had to step down, or at least was made to step down, um, and sort of relinquish what seemed to be a promising political career. And it's, I don't know, at this point it's just kind of it seems those kind of eventualities are less and less likely. So it seems that the function of scandal, the broader function of scandal, if you go back in political history to like the 90s, is really no longer there in the same way. It just doesn't it doesn't and I think it's partly this kind of this kind of fracturing of media and sort of media manufactured reality, where there isn't so much a desire to create a sort of um, a kind of public life, having a sort of center that is oriented towards some kind of shared sense of decency or something like that. And so that there's some sense of offense at public figures who violate those expectations in one way or another. And so it's striking that instead what you have is sort of every political event is sort of fractalized and can just be kind of reconstructed in an infinite number of ways, in such a way that it seems to all end up being largely kind of neutral in terms of how it plays out. So I don't know, but also it's just interesting how it seems that this sort of scandal just isn't. I mean, yeah, this kind of scandal just no longer has the same kind of um, sort of attractiveness or allure that it used to have. So it seems to me like people have to kind of have to like make an effort to make themselves outraged about these things. Like there isn't really the kind of spontaneous outrage. So anyway, those are just some stray remarks towards a kind of broader history of the radical shift in the politics of scandal.
If you're confused by names like Tony Bobolinsky, 10% for the big guy, all this stuff, I recommend reading Laptop from Hell, a book by friend of Compact Miranda Devine, which is really a useful guide to all this. So, Laptop from Hell, Miranda Devine.
Thanks, Matthew. So yeah, sticking with Ukraine and Russia, for our final topic this week, we're discussing a Ukrainian NGO. It's called something like Texty, which has just published a list of US individuals and entities that are supposedly, quote, impeding aid to Ukraine. This is all a bit murky, these kind of blacklists. Sohrab, as I mentioned, has written a Substack on this phenomenon. It's been covered in a couple of magazines who have also been named by this Ukrainian NGO. But I'm wondering what's going on here. Who are these people?
This list, as you mentioned, Nina, it names a wide variety of American individuals and entities. Uh, you know, and the political views of these people can't be reconciled. They aren't part of a single movement or political tendency. Donald Trump isn't the same as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In fact, they're running against each other and denouncing each other. Uh, you know, J.D. Vance is not the same as Tulsi Gabbard. On and on and on. As you mentioned, as you said, Sohrab and I are on this list. So is Compact Magazine, and we, when one appears as a quote unquote listed entity, kind of look at this and say, okay, well, what is this all about? What am I being accused of? And as you say, the accusation seems to be impeding Ukrainian aid, and then of course there's an insinuation that to oppose escalation of the conflict in Ukraine is effectively to be aligned with Russian information and the war aims of that country. And there's something a little odd about all of this. We do know that the journalist who compiled this list has, worked a fellowship with the U.S. State Department. So there's some connection. Maybe that's all the connection there is. Maybe there's a somewhat closer connection between this list and certain government entities. Yeah, I mean, what to make of all this? I guess a couple observations are in order. One, Ukraine is a foreign country. It isn't part of the United States. Uh, American citizens aren't obliged to support its war aims or to put its own national good ahead of that of their own country. In fact, I'd say that American citizens should naturally look out for the interests of their country first of all. Um, Now, there are arguments to be made that by aiding Ukraine, we bleed Russia, an American geopolitical foe. I think it would be more intelligent to uh, try to first settle and diffuse this conflict, and then on the longer term, think about how relations with Russia can be thawed so that Russia can be turned, however slightly, against China, which seems like a greater threat to American strategic preeminence. So that's my vague reading of this. I do think that inquiries need to be conducted. I hope that Congress, with its subpoena power, looks into this, into the financial backing and the origins of this list. There's something frankly odd about a foreign entity questioning the patriotism of Americans, who whether they are the descendants of recent arrivals in America or whether their families go back to the 1600s in this country are, people with full rights to participate in public discussion. This is a legitimate policy disagreement. It's fully legitimate to support escalation in Ukraine and to champion America's involvement therein. Lots of people do that. It's completely legitimate. It is also completely legitimate to raise doubts about it. And any suggestion otherwise reveals fundamentally anti-democratic spirit. We hear a lot about democracy. Certain figures, countries are held up as examples of democracy. The proof of the pudding is in the tasting. I think that this list shows that there is a really anti-democratic spirit at work among the self-styled defenders of that system.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know why it seems so difficult to hold a position which is something like we need a diplomatic effort to solve war, whether it's in Ukraine and Russia or in Israel Palestine. It seems that very difficult for people to hold a position that is, well, maybe there's you know bad behavior on both sides, and maybe both sides have a point, and maybe both sides have their reasons. I think this constant polarization into friends and enemies is yeah, as you say, well, anti-democratic, both in terms of stopping people or trying to stop people from expressing those views, but also anti-democratic in the sense that it doesn't promote diplomacy and other routes to solving conflicts which are extremely violent and murderous. Yeah.
Just very quickly, I want to repeat a point I made in my Substack, compactmag.substack.com. The headline of this latest one is, "So you ended up on the Ukrainian enemies list, ... And the point I make at the very end is, has history ever vindicated people who make paranoid enemies lists the way this Ukrainian NGO did? Possibly with some links to the U.S. State Department, it seems, as the American Conservative has suggested. And so has history ever vindicated someone like that? And then I thought, I didn't put this in the Substack, so this is like bonus podcast comments. Well, there is one person who, in Compact's telling or read, did make paranoid enemies list and has been vindicated by historical revisionism, and that is Richard Nixon. But his paranoid list making is not the reason for his vindication. It maybe helped his somewhat unjust downfall. But anyway, so small kind of historical assessment correction to my Substack piece.
And with that, I'd like to thank Sohrab, Matthew, Geoff, and Stephen Adubatu, our producer. Don't forget to subscribe at compactmag.com if you haven't already, and thank you for listening.